Welcome to the Lab Leak. I'm really glad you're joining us today. The material we are looking at is, well, it represents a pretty significant departure from our usual subjects.
Yeah, it really does.
We're diving into this massive, heavily documented dossier, and it's basically a deep dive into allegations of targeted deception at the highest echelons of global science.
Right, and the focal point of this entire compilation of records, which is expensive, by the way, is Christian Drosten.
Exactly, one of the most prominent virologists in the world. So our mission today is to take these sources, we're talking legal precedents, internal communications, historical data, and just reconstruct the timeline they present for you.
I think the central tension here, the thing that really drives this dossier, is the profound disconnect between what was stated definitively in public and what was being debated quietly behind closed doors.
The gap between the public and the private.
Exactly. We are looking at a situation where a global scientific consensus was established, and it branded a specific hypothesis as a dangerous conspiracy. But the private communications from that exact same time period bristle those same scientists discussing the technical plausibility of that very hypothesis.
And the dossier doesn't just evaluate the virology, right?
No, it goes much further. It rigorously applies German legal frameworks to this behavior, specifically examining how the law treats the deliberate maintenance of a false public consensus over an extended period.
Which is fascinating. But before we get into the timeline, we really need to establish the parameters for this analysis, just so you know exactly where we're coming from.
Right, ground rules.
Yeah, we are relying entirely on the provided dossier. That means our sources are the FOIA emails obtained over the last few years, the official historical biosafety incident reports, specific rulings from the German Federal Court of Justice, the BGH, and the updated 2025 and 2026 publishing guidelines.
And we should emphasize we are acting strictly as impartial guides through this material.
Absolutely. We're not endorsing the viewpoints of the content, and we are definitely not taking political sides on what is obviously a heavily polarized issue.
Our objective is just to unpack the factual chronological data provided so you can understand the mechanics of how this specific narrative was constructed and maintained.
Right. So tell me a bit about the methodology of this dossier, because it uses a specific legal concept.
It does. It's built around the concept of an Indizinkette.
An Indizinkette.
Right, which translates to a chain of circumstantial evidence. In German jurisprudence, you don't always need a signed confession to prove deception.
You don't need someone writing down, "I am deceiving the public."
Exactly. Instead, you build a seamless chain of established facts. What a person's professional expertise mandated they know, what their internal communications revealed they believed, and then what they ultimately chose to broadcast to the public.
Okay, let's start with that public broadcast. February 19, 2020. The global landscape is just highly volatile at this point.
Unprecedented panic.
Unprecedented. The pandemic is accelerating, public panic is mounting, and there's just a massive vacuum of hard data. And into that vacuum steps The Lancet, arguably one of the most prestigious medical journals in existence.
And they publish a statement.
Yes, a statement co-signed by 27 prominent scientists, including Christian Drosten. And this document explicitly condemned what it called conspiracy theories, suggesting that COVID-19 does not have a natural origin.
That phrase, conspiracy theories, is doing an enormous amount of heavy lifting in that statement.
How so?
Well, think about February 2020. Governments, media organizations, they were all looking to institutions like The Lancet for definitive guidance. By deploying that specific terminology, the signatories fundamentally altered the trajectory of the global discourse.
They didn't just say, hey, natural origin is our leading hypothesis.
No, they went much further. They categorized any inquiry into a non-natural origin, like a laboratory accident, as a moral failing, a danger to public health.
Which creates a chilling effect.
A profound chilling effect. In the scientific community, pursuing a hypothesis that has been publicly branded a conspiracy by 27 leading figures is basically professional suicide. You don't get grants. You don't get published. You face immense peer ostracization.
So the dossier spends a significant amount of time challenging the premise of that Lancet statement by pulling historical epidemiological records. It asks this really foundational question. Based on the scientific record, is a lab leak a conspiracy theory? Or is it a documented historical reality?
And the records provided show it is absolutely the latter.
Right. The sources detail 6 separate documented SARS-CoV-1 lab escapes. And these occurred between 2003 and 2004.
Keep in mind, this is after the original SARS epidemic had been successfully contained globally.
So the only way the virus was getting out was through the labs.
Precisely. The dossier includes the 2014 Martin Formansky report alongside WHO and CDC archives to meticulously build this historical context. These aren't fringe rumors. They are internationally recognized biosafety failures.
Let's walk through them. The first one, detailed in the dossier, occurred in Singapore, late summer of 2003.
Right. So a 27-year-old graduate student working in a BSL-3 facility contracted SARS-CoV-1, and the investigation revealed it was a case of cross-contamination.
He didn't even know he was working with it, right?
Exactly. He was officially working with West Nile virus samples, but those samples had been contaminated with active SARS virus in the lab. He was handling a deadly pathogen without even knowing it was in the room.
But that cross-contamination in Singapore illustrates a pretty frightening procedural breakdown. But the incident in Taiwan in December 2003, that one really escalates the severity.
It does. We are talking about a 44-year-old lieutenant colonel conducting research in a military BSL-4 facility.
BSL-4, that is the highest possible biosafety level.
Designed for pathogens with high aerosol transmission risks and no known treatments, the spacesuit labs.
And how did the infection occur there?
It was a spilled waste incident. The researcher was attempting to clean up liquid biohazard waste, but he bypassed protocol. He opted not to wear the mandatory protective gear for the cleanup.
So even in environments engineered with multi-million-dollar fail-safe, positive pressure suits, airlocks human error just circumvents the architecture.
Always. But the dossier places the absolute heaviest emphasis on the Beijing cluster, which unfolded between February and May of 2004.
At the National Institute of Virology.
Right, which was a central SARS reference laboratory in China. The root cause here was a catastrophic failure in inactivation protocols.
Explain what that means for us.
It means they had active live SARS virus, and they were supposed to neutralize it, kill it, so it could be studied safely. But they failed. Active virus was improperly inactivated and then transferred from a secure high containment area into a standard BSL-2 lab.
And the dossier notes that this BSL-2 lab was actually designated as a diarrhea virus laboratory.
Yes, and the human cost of that specific protocol failure was devastating.
A 26-year-old female graduate student.
Yeah. She was working in that BSL-2 lab. She had no authorization or reason to be handling live SARS virus, but she was infected purely through environmental contamination. She felt ill, boarded a train to travel back to her home province, and developed severe symptoms.
And her mother cared for her.
Her mother, who was a physician, cared for her and contracted the virus. And her mother tragically died.
And it didn't stop there.
No. Weeks later, a 31-year-old postdoc at the same Beijing Institute was infected through the exact same environmental contamination pathway in that BSL-2 lab. Ultimately, that single inactivation failure led to 4 distinct transmission events, 9 confirmed infections, and 1 fatality.
It's just incredible. And the dossier broadens the scope beyond just coronaviruses, doesn't it?
Yes, to establish that virology as a field has a long, documented history of catastrophic containment failures. It references the 1977 Russian flu. The consensus in modern phylogenetic analysis is that the H1N1 strain responsible for that global mini-pandemic was a lab escape.
Likely from live attenuated vaccine trials.
Exactly. It also highlights the 2005 incident where a major U.S. reference laboratory, operating under CDC protocols, committed a massive logistical error. They accidentally shipped live, highly infectious H2N2 influenza virus to 3,747 laboratories across 18 countries.
Because they thought they were distributing a harmless, inactivated control strain.
Right. Just a massive error.
So the reason the dossier painstakingly details these historical events is to establish Christian Drosten's baseline professional knowledge, because Drosten was a pioneering SARS-1 researcher.
He was. He is credited with developing the very first PCR diagnostic test for the original SARS virus in 2003. He spent his early career working intimately with the virus in high-containment BSL-3 labs in Hamburg and Berlin.
And he was deeply integrated into the WHO networks that were actively rewriting global biosafety guidelines as a direct response to those specific escapes in Singapore, Taiwan, and Beijing.
Right, so the dossier's legal argument here is that Drosten possessed positive mandatory knowledge that lab leaks are a frequent, undeniable reality of virological research.
That establishes the foundation for the legal concept of intent.
Exactly. To prove deception under the German framework the dossier utilizes, you must demonstrate that the individual possessed the requisite knowledge to know their public statement was false or misleading.
So by documenting his career trajectory and the unavoidable reality of these biosafety failures, the dossier establishes that he knew, empirically, that laboratory accidents occur even under the most stringent security measures.
Consequently, lending his signature and authority to a document that labels the mere investigation of a lab origin as a conspiracy theory stands in direct contradiction to his foundational scientific expertise.
The dossier really drives this point home with an anecdote. And this is a wild story that reveals his internal calculus regarding biosafety protocols. It pulls from an April 2020 episode of the podcast This Week in Virology, or TYV.
Right, Drosten was a guest.
Yeah, and the conversation turned to his early days working with SARS-1 in 2003. He casually recounted a story where he needed to transport a bottle of highly infectious SARS-1 Vero cell culture from a facility in Frankfurt to his lab in Hamburg.
And the official hazardous materials transport protocols were apparently taking too long.
So he bypassed the regulations entirely. He put the live virus culture in the trunk of his private car and drove it down the Autobahn himself.
The stark contrast between the multi-million-dollar airlocks of a BSL-3 facility and a Tupperware container sliding around the trunk of a personal vehicle is jarring enough. But it's his reaction on the podcast that the dossier focuses on.
Right, he laughs about the incident. He states, "I can't be arrested for that now. It's too long ago. Ha ha ha."
From a behavioral and legal analysis standpoint, that specific reaction is highly illuminating. Transporting a risk group 3 pathogen in a personal, unapproved vehicle is a severe violation of the German Biological Agents Ordinance and the Infection Protection Act.
A traffic accident on the Autobahn could have resulted in an uncontrolled release of the virus.
Exactly, and the dossier treats this not as a mere conversational tangent, but as a critical psychological indicator. It reveals an individual who is willing to circumvent stringent safety regulations for convenience, recognizes the inherent risk as a humorous anecdote,
Which helps establish the state of mind required for the indecent cat.
yes, someone who internally trivializes profound biosafety risks, yet publicly co-authors a definitive statement condemning anyone who expresses concern about those very same risks in an institutional setting.
That historical and behavioral baseline sets the stage for the events of early 2020. The dossier shifts its focus to the private communications occurring simultaneously with the drafting of the Lancet statement.
We're talking about February 1st, 2020.
Right. Jeremy Farrar, the director of the Wellcome Trust, organized a highly restricted, unrecorded teleconference at the behest of Anthony Fauci, and Kristen Drosten was a key participant on this call.
The catalyst for this emergency teleconference was an email from Christian Andersen, an evolutionary biologist.
What did Anderson find?
Well, Andersen and a cohort of other virologists had been analyzing the early genomic sequences of SARS-CoV-2 coming out of Wuhan, and Andersen communicated to Fauci and Farrar that the virus exhibited features that appeared engineered.
Engineered. That's a huge word to use in that context.
The biological anomalies were stark enough to warrant pulling the world's leading virologists into a secure, private discussion to assess whether the virus could have been manipulated in a laboratory.
And the technical core of this concern revolves around a specific structural feature of the virus, right? The furin cleavage site, or FCS.
Yes, the dossier gets incredibly granular on the biology here. It focuses on the S1-S2 junction of the virus's spike protein.
The spike protein being essentially the apparatus the virus uses to bind to and enter human cells.
Specifically attaching to the ACE2 receptors. The furin cleavage site is a unique sequence of 4 amino acids, proline, arginine, alanine, denoted as PRRA, and it's located exactly at this junction.
So what are the mechanics of that PRRA sequence? Why does it matter so much?
That sequence is what makes SARS-CoV-2 so devastatingly efficient at infecting humans. Human cells naturally produce an enzyme called furin. When the virus encounters a human cell, our own furin enzyme recognizes that specific PRRA sequence and cleaves or cuts the spike protein at the X1-S2 junction.
It primes it.
Exactly. This cleavage event primes the spike, allowing the virus to fuse its membrane with the human cell membrane with incredible efficiency.
So it's basically using our own biology against us as a key.
Yes. And what alarmed Andersen and the others in early 2020 is that SARS-CoV-2 is the absolute only virus within its immediate subgenus of sarbecoviruses to possess a furin cleavage site.
None of the related bat coronaviruses have it.
None of the hundreds of known bat coronaviruses closely related to it have this feature. Phylogenetically, it represents an abrupt and highly anomalous evolutionary leap.
The dossier then connects this structural anomaly to the 2018 defuse proposal. This document represents just a monumental piece of the evidentiary chain.
It really does.
Peter Daszak of the EcoHealth Alliance, Shi Zhengli of the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and Ralph Barrick of the University of North Carolina submitted this grant proposal to DARPA, the Research and Development Agency of the U.S. Department of Defense.
And in this proposal, they explicitly sought funding to conduct gain-of-function research on bat coronaviruses.
And the methodology they outlined, this is the crucial part, involved deliberately inserting human-specific cleavage sites into bat coronaviruses.
Sites exactly matching the function of the PRI sequence found in SARS-CoV-2. They wanted to evaluate their potential to cross over and infect human populations.
But DARPA rejected it, right?
DARPA ultimately rejected the diffuse proposal. Their review process determined that the research constituted dangerous gain-of-function work and that the safety mitigations proposed by the EcoHealth team were grossly inadequate.
However, the dossier points out the chilling spatial and factual convergence here. You have the outbreak of a novel coronavirus featuring the exact unique cleavage site described in the rejected proposal emerging in the massive metropolitan center of Wuhan.
Right. The outbreak did not begin in the remote bat caves of Yunnan province, hundreds of miles away. It ignited mere miles from the Wuhan Institute of Virology,
which was the preeminent global laboratory conducting research on bat coronaviruses and a central partner in the diffuse proposal.
And Christian Drosten was thoroughly familiar with this research landscape. He knew the principal investigators involved.
So we return to the aftermath of that February 1st teleconference. The elite group has discussed the anomalous S1-S2 junction and the engineered features. Just days later, Drosten sends an email to this specific cohort.
The dossier highlights this as the smoking gun regarding intent.
Yes, and we need to quote this exactly as it appears in the source material. Drosten wrote, "Can someone help me with one question? Didn't we congregate to challenge a certain theory? And if we could, drop it."
The epistemological implications of that sentence are staggering.
Didn't we congregate to challenge a certain theory? And if we could, drop it.
In the scientific method, you congregate to evaluate data. You stress test hypotheses, and you follow the evidence to its logical conclusion, regardless of where it leads. The email, however, explicitly outlines a predetermined objective.
To drop the theory.
It demonstrates that the primary function of this elite working group was not objective inquiry, but the orchestrated suppression of the laboratory origin theory. He is asking for confirmation of their shared mandate to eliminate a specific line of scientific questioning.
And the timeline is what makes that email so devastating. Less than 2 weeks after sending a private email urging his colleagues to drop the theory, Drosten publicly co-signed the Lancet statement.
Utilizing his immense authority to brand anyone investigating that exact theory as a conspiracy theorist.
The public narrative was just seamlessly engineered to contradict the private reality.
And this chronological progression leads the dossier directly into the legal ramifications, focusing heavily on a sworn statement made 2 years later.
March 2022.
Right. Christian Drosten was engaged in a civil dispute in Germany. As part of those proceedings, he executed an eidesstattliche Versicherung, a legally binding affidavit.
Under Section 156 of the German Criminal Code, submitting a false sworn affidavit is a severe offense, punishable by up to 3 years in prison. So the language used in these documents is scrutinized to the letter.
Very carefully constructed.
The dossier provides the precise German text of this affidavit, and we have those original quotes. The first assertion reads, "Während meiner Teilnahme wurde keine Verabredung getroffen, die Möglichkeit einer Laborherkunft in der Öffentlichkeit zu vertuschen. Mir ist auch nicht bekannt, dass eine solche Verabredung zu einem späteren Zeitpunkt getroffen wurde."
Right, so he's saying that during his participation, no agreement was made to cover up a lab origin in public, and he isn't aware of any such agreement being made later.
And the second critical quote is, "Ich habe kein Interesse, den Verdacht über den Ursprung des SARS-CoV-2-Virus in eine bestimmte Richtung zu lenken. Insbesondere hatte und habe ich kein persönliches Interesse, die Laborthese als Ursprung des Virus auszuschließen. Gäbe es Anhaltspunkte für die Richtigkeit der Laborthese, würde ich dies mit Nachdruck in der wissenschaftlichen und öffentlichen Diskussion vertreten."
When analyzing the text where Drosten swears, "Während meiner Teilnahme wurde keine Verabredung getroffen," that no agreement was made to cover up a lab origin, the dossier contrasts this absolute denial with the empirical reality of the FOIA communications.
But it is the linguistic maneuvering in the subsequent sentences that is really revealing.
Yes, he claims to have kein Interesse, no interest in steering the narrative in a specific direction, and specifically no personal interest in excluding the lab thesis. He further deploys a conditional statement, asserting that if there were indications supporting the lab thesis, he would mit Nachdruck vigorously represent it in scientific and public discussion.
The contradiction presented by the dossier here is massive. The assertion of having no interest in excluding the lab thesis cannot be logically reconciled with an email sent from his own account asking his colleagues, "Didn't we congregate to challenge a certain theory, and if we could, drop it?"
It just doesn't align.
Furthermore, his claim that he would vigorously represent the lab thesis if there were evidence completely ignores the fact that Christian Andersen and others explicitly presented the furin cleavage site as potential evidence of engineering on the February 1 call.
Right. Instead of vigorously representing that data, the group moved to suppress it.
The dossier utilizes this affidavit to demonstrate a persistent pattern of obscuring the historical record. But what adds another layer of complexity is how his stance in media interviews began to subtly fracture over time.
Even as the Lancet statement remained untouched.
Exactly. Let's look at June 2021, an interview with the Swiss publication Republic. Drosten made a notable pivot here.
He conceded that a laboratory accident was im Rahmen des Möglichen, within the realm of possibility. He acknowledged the existence of the furin cleavage site and even briefly discussed the theoretical mechanisms of engineering it, although he still categorized it as extremely unlikely.
But the evolution continued. February 2022, during an interview with the Süddeutsche Zeitung, or SZ, his rhetoric shifted further toward plausible deniability. He stated that had he been fully briefed on the specific experiments being conducted in Wuhan, he would have at least asked questions prior to lending his signature to the Lancet statement.
He was retroactively distancing his authority from the very document he helped legitimize.
And then the most stark admission came recently, in January 2025. Speaking to the TASS newspaper, Drosten admitted that reviewing the 2018 diffuse proposal left him with an ungutes Gefühl, a profoundly uneasy feeling.
He explicitly stated that the experiments outlined in the DARPA grant were by no means harmless, and acknowledged that the passage of time had only increased his skepticism regarding a purely natural origin.
So this media trajectory forms the crux of the dossier's final legal argument. If Drosten possesses an uneasy feeling about the diffuse experiments, if he publicly concedes that a lab leak is within the realm of possibility, and if he admits he would have interrogated the data differently had he been fully informed,
why does the February 2020 Lancet statement remain active and uncorrected?
Exactly. Why does a document that definitively labels these valid scientific concerns as conspiracy theories still bear his signature?
To answer that, the dossier plunges into the intricacies of German criminal and civil law, specifically Section 263 of the Criminal Code, which governs fraud and arglistige Täuschung, or fraudulent deception.
Right, because the legal framework recognizes that individuals engaged in complex deceptions rarely document their explicit intent to commit a crime. You don't find emails saying, "I plan to defraud the global public."
Therefore, the courts rely on the indice enquête. The Federal Court of Justice has repeatedly affirmed that a well-constructed chain of circumstantial evidence is sufficient to establish dolus eventualis, or conditional intent.
What does that mean in practice?
This legal threshold, defined as für möglich halten und billigen, to consider possible and accept, means the perpetrator does not need to be 100% certain their statement is false. It is enough that they recognize a substantial risk that the statement is false or misleading, and yet they proceed to make it anyway, willingly accepting the consequences of deceiving the public.
The dossier contrasts his 2020 actions with his own earlier writings to prove he possessed this exact level of awareness. In 2012, Drosten co-authored a piece titled Biosafety of Artificial Viruses. We Must Endure the Risks.
In this article, he offered a full-throated defense of controversial gain-of-function research, arguing vehemently against censoring or suppressing the publication of such work.
He explicitly acknowledged that laboratory accidents are real fears, but argued that society must endure the risks through total transparency, because suppressing information only breeds rumors and conspiracy theories.
The juxtaposition is stark. In 2012, he articulated a clear understanding that lab leaks are a genuine risk and that transparency is the only antidote to conspiracy theories. Yet in 2020, operating in a highly pressurized environment, he participated in a coordinated effort to suppress transparency.
And utilized the term conspiracy theory as a weapon to shut down legitimate inquiry into those exact same real fears.
He possessed the requisite knowledge. To explain how the law views the continuation of this deception, the dossier draws a parallel to one of the most significant BGH rulings in modern German legal history, the VW diesel emissions scandal.
The VW case is a really brilliant mechanism for understanding corporate or institutional deception. Volkswagen didn't execute thousands of individual fraudulent contracts with specific consumers.
No, the corporate apparatus made a strategic, systemic decision to deploy defeat devices in their engine software to cheat emissions testing.
But the crucial legal precedent established by the BGH wasn't just about the initial installation of the software. The court ruled that the fraud was actively maintained through silence.
Volkswagen executives knew the software was illegal and that their marketing was wildly misleading, yet for years they failed to correct the record, issue recalls, or notify regulators.
So the courts determined that the act of leaving those false statements uncorrected in the public domain constituted a continuous, intentional act of deception.
The silence was the ongoing mechanism of the fraud. The dossier maps this legal architecture directly onto the Lancet statement.
The document was published in February 2020. Over the ensuing years, the scientific landscape fundamentally shifted. The diffuse proposal was exposed. The FBI and the Department of Energy issued assessments concluding a lab leak was plausible.
Drosten himself publicly admitted his doubts and his Ungutgefühl.
Yet the statement condemning the lab leak as a conspiracy remains untouched in a premier medical journal.
The dossier applies the legal doctrine of Sturhaftung, or interferer liability, to this exact scenario. Under German media and civil law, if you participate in the publication of a statement, you create a public condition.
This is known as Ingren's liability arising from preceding conduct.
If subsequent evidence reveals that the statement you helped publish is materially false or misleading, you cannot simply walk away. You have an affirmative legal duty to mitigate the danger you created by correcting the record.
By failing to act, you become a stirrer, a disturber, who's actively maintaining an ongoing violation of rights.
Furthermore, this legal duty is mirrored and heavily reinforced by the strict ethical frameworks governing scientific publishing. The dossier points to the 2025 Region 3 guidelines from COPE, the Committee on Publication Ethics, and the 2026 updates from the ICMJE, the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors.
These are not mere suggestions. They are the foundational operational protocols for legitimate medical journals, including The Lancet. Those updated guidelines are unequivocal.
They mandate that any honest errors, significant inaccuracies, or misleading statements must be addressed and corrected promptly.
If the core conclusions of a publication are found to be seriously flawed or unsupported by subsequent data, retraction is required.
The guidelines emphasize that retraction is not a punitive measure against the authors, but an essential mechanism to protect the integrity and reliability of the global scientific record.
And crucially, the burden of action lies with the authors. The rules stipulate that corrections must be initiated as soon as possible after the inaccuracies are recognized.
This is where the dossier's synthesis is most pointed. You have a statement from 2020 declaring the lab leak a conspiracy. You have the author acknowledging in multiple subsequent years that a lab leak is a technical possibility and that the specific research in Wuhan was alarming.
You have a documented history of severe SARS lab escapes.
You have international publishing ethics explicitly demanding the prompt correction of misleading literature.
Yet, the Lancet statement remains actively hosted online, unamended.
The dossier's conclusion is that this failure to retract or correct is not an oversight. Under the framework of Sturhaftung and the VW precedent, the failure to act transforms the initial misleading statement into a sustained, intentional act of deception.
The persistent silence is the ongoing violation. As we step back and synthesize the vast amount of material we've covered in this deep dive, the implications are profound.
They really are.
We began with a seemingly impenetrable public declaration of scientific consensus. However, the chronological compilation of sources, the FOIA emails, the historical biosafety data, the shifting public statements, paints a picture of a consensus that was engineered through private coordination rather than arrived at through transparent evidentiary analysis.
The contrast between the public denunciation of the lab leak and the private emails coordinating to drop the theory exposes a significant fracture in the integrity of the institutional scientific process.
Connecting this analysis back to the broader landscape of information consumption, it serves as a critical case study in how authority is leveraged to manage public perception for you, the listener.
In an era saturated with complex data, society heavily relies on scientific institutions to distill reality and guide policy. This dossier demonstrates the vital necessity of maintaining critical distance, demanding access to raw data, and understanding the mechanisms by which institutional consensus can be shaped by factors entirely separate from objective scientific inquiry.
A headline in a prestigious journal is a data point, not an unassailable truth. It fundamentally challenges the assumption that the scientific record is self-correcting in real time.
If the established mechanisms designed to safeguard that record, the peer review systems, the ethics committees, the leading researchers, can permit a demonstrably misleading and highly consequential statement to remain uncorrected and influential for over 6 years, it raises a deeply unsettling question about the architecture of truth in the modern era.
Who is truly accountable for maintaining the integrity of the historical record? And it leaves us wondering what other established truths or dismissed conspiracies of today will be revealed as the managed realities of tomorrow.
It is a critical question that demands sustained attention.
Thank you for joining us on this exploration of the Lub leak. Keep analyzing the sources and keep asking the difficult questions.